So far, the Basstravaganza has mainly been about catching fish and making lures to catch fish. But as I warned you in the first episode, this Basstravaganza will wander off that topic. And in this episode, we're going to do just that. We're going to focus on fish habitat and how it has often been badly degraded and ruined by humans. I'm going to compare two watersheds that are very similar in many ways. Both are on the west coast of Vancouver Island within the temperate rainforest, less than 50 kilometers apart from each other. Both systems contain a lake of similar shape and size that has a river running through the lake that supports runs of salmon and trout that migrate through from the ocean. And although the rivers are very similar in many ways, there's one big difference between them. One watershed is covered by dense forest of old giant trees that have never been logged. The other has been brutally clear-cut over the past few decades. I want to start by talking about rivers in a theoretical way. This is actually a branch of science, and you can study up and get a degree on it if you want to. It's called hydrology, and the study of the shape and form of land and rivers and lakes is part of a field called geomorphology. But I'm going to try to bring this down to a simple common sense level that can be understood by people who don't have PhDs. What is a river? Most people would say it's a place where water flows downhill, and this is partly correct. But a river is really much more than that. A river is more than just an object. A river is a process. Better to think of rivers as natural engines that use the force of gravity and the amazing chemical properties of water to transform huge mountain ranges made of solid rock into sand and mud and transport that material as sediment to the ocean. I'm going to start by showing some cartoons I drew up to illustrate this process. We'll start with some mountains with steep slabs of bare rock that are exposed to the elements. Rainwater erodes some of the exposed rock by chemical reaction, and rain also gets into cracks and splits off pieces of rock when it freezes. This is called erosion. That eroded material falls down the slopes until it hits the bottom. Primitive plants like lichens and mosses grow on the rock faces and help this process along. The bits and pieces of rock fall down the slopes until they eventually fill the bottoms of the mountain valleys. Rainwater and snowmelt saturate the eroded debris in the valley bottoms. Higher forms of plants, like bushes and trees, sent roots down into this eroded debris to suck up the water and chemicals there and convert it into organic matter. Over the centuries, the eroded pieces of rock are broken down into smaller and smaller bits, which mix with dead leaves and branches and trunks to form soil. Over time, the soil gets deeper along the side hills, and the saturated layer at the bottom gets closer to the surface. This is called the water table. Here you can see the bright blue line. That's the water table. If you drill a hole into the ground that stops above the water table, it will be dry. If you drill further down below the water table, there will be water at the bottom of the hole. If you keep going further down the valley, you'll come to some places where the water table is higher than the level of the land. This is what most people think of as a stream or a river. But the visible flowing water is only a small part of the whole process. It's critical to remember that the flow of every river has two parts, one above ground and the other underground. During wet weather, there's lots of water flowing above ground. During drought, the surface flow shrinks and a greater proportion of the water flows underground. If the drought lasts long enough, the entire flow of the river may drop underground. We often say that the river has run dry, but it really hasn't. It's still flowing, it's just that there's no more flow above the surface. And here's a little tip from Humpty Dumpling. Even though I don't have a PhD, the part that flows underground is not good habitat for fish. And it's important to remember that there's much more than just water flowing down a river. There are also dissolved minerals, silt, sand, gravel, rocks, boulders, plus leaves, branches, and sometimes even whole entire gigantic trees, all heading downstream. Over the fullness of geologic time, everything, including the biggest trees and the biggest mountains, will be washed into the sea by the river. The shape of a river is determined by where these sediments are deposited. Here's another cartoon I drew to illustrate this in cross-section. The layers of bedrock are tilted by compression caused by plate tectonics. Layers of hard rock erode slower than soft rock. Erosion scours out the softer parts of the stream bed. The sediment is dropped wherever the current no longer has the power to push it downstream. The biggest boulders drop out in the shallowest, fastest water, and the sand and silt drop out in the slowest water. Where the river flows over a ridge of solid rock, it may scour the gravel clean down to bedrock. We call this a waterfall. Here you can see where the N2 river flows over a ridge of hard, solid rock, harder than the other rock around it, which has eroded away. So the shape of rivers is determined by the underlying rock formations and by the sediment that is washed down the channel. But in BC, there's another critical factor that determines the physical shape of rivers, especially on the coast, especially here on Vancouver Island. Even though it's often ignored in resource management planning, that factor is trees. We used to have some of the biggest trees that ever grew on Earth growing along the shores of our rivers, mostly gone now. If a river is not flowing over solid bedrock, it's flowing over sediment. When the flood currents hit something big that they can't move, like a boulder, they'll scour the smaller sediment away. When the flood is gone, there'll be a deep hole beside the boulder. In coastal BC, the biggest objects along rivers were the root wads of giant old-growth trees. They were the only thing other than bedrock and a few huge boulders that could withstand the power of the raging floods. When a river hits something it can't move, it scours out a deep hole. You can see how the river has scoured a hole beneath the roots of these small cedars along N5 River. If that clump of small trees was gone, there would be no deep water here. The river wants to wash the bank away, but it can't because the roots of the cedars hold the gravel and dirt in place. Instead of washing the bank away, it scours a deep hole under this root wad. The current is deflected away from the bank, and the material scoured out from beneath the root wad is distributed into a riffle of superb spawning gravel. The current bounces across the stream, down the riffle, and then it plows into the opposite bank and digs another scour hole beneath the roots of other big trees. Here's a simple cartoon of what is happening. The valley bottom is filled with gravel. The current hits the roots of a big tree, scours out a deep hole, spits out a pile of gravel that forms a riffle, jumps across to the opposite bank, and does the same thing again, and again, and again. So you can see how this pattern develops into a series of alternating pools and riffles, where a river flows through a forest of old-growth trees. This cartoon is basically a before and after version of most of our clear-cut rivers here on Vancouver Island. They used to be a complicated mix of shallow and deep water, where deep pools were connected by flowing riffles. Now they're simple and wide and shallow, and they dry up as soon as it stops raining. Oh yes, and one other thing. They used to be swarming with big fish, and now they're not. Look at the huge ancient Sitka spruces and red cedars that anchor the shoreline of this deep pool. The pool has been there for centuries, like the trees. If you cut the trees, you lose the pool and you lose the fish. Now compare my cartoon with this aerial photo of a river that has never been clear-cut. That's right, pay attention. You thought this show was just going to be a fishing hero reeling in one fish after another. It's too late. Now you have to think. Do you notice the similarity? I do. What would happen to the river here if these big cedars were not holding the bank in place? it would wash away immediately along with the land I'm standing on. If you cut these trees, their roots die. After a few years, the stumps would be undercut by the current and wash away. The river would become much wider and shallower. The deep undercut banks where fish hide would be gone. More about the main channels later. But first, let's take a hike up the side of the mountain. I used to work there. It's not only the main river channels that suffer from clear cutting. Along the steep mountain tributary streams, it's the same. The roots of giant trees are often the only thing that holds the soil on the mountainsides. When a mountain slope is clear cut, the big dead stumps will often wash out a few years later, unleashing a torrent of wood and gravel that crashes down the mountain during floods. These debris torrents pick up momentum as they rage down the slope, ripping out more and more earth and stumps and even whole trees as they go crashing down the side of the mountain. Here's some video I shot years ago around Escalante River that gives a better idea of this. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but this video is worth more than the millions of words of BS that has been spewed out by politicians and industry shills when they say that the government has been protecting fish habitat from logging impacts. We're looking at a steep, freshly logged side hill, freshly planted with a new crop of trees. Notice all the shattered, broken wood lying around. That's what remained on the hill after it was clear cut and then burned off. This wood is mostly old-growth red cedar, and some of it is valuable for the shake and shingle industry. That's why I was there. I was part of a crew that would roam over these clear cuts with chainsaws and axes and wedges, cutting and splitting the good wood from the bad into 18 and 24-inch blocks. Then we'd fly the blocks out to the road with a helicopter. You can see a huge windfall cedar in the upper right. That tree is probably 3 meters wide at its base, but it wasn't worth the loggers' trouble to harvest. In those days, I would have killed to get a chance to hack up a huge tree like this. On this day, I brought my video camera to work, and I stopped the crummy in a few places to record the scene. Notice that the ancient forest that had covered these slopes for thousands of years was almost entirely clear-cut within a decade. Now, everywhere you look, you see giant scars running down the mountains. These are the remnants of torrential floods. After all the huge trees along a steep gully are killed by logging, the entire stump is vulnerable to getting washed out as the roots die. If a stump washes out, it crashes down the mountain, along with a pile of boulders and mud. And this debris smashes into other stumps below and knocks them loose from the hillside, and they smash down the gully into the stumps below, and the process feeds on itself until the entire gully may be scoured out clean down to bedrock. You can see that during a heavy rain, water will be flowing down this road from both directions until it pours over the edge at the lowest spot. Let's follow this water down the mountain. Hundreds of gigantic stumps and thousands of truckloads of boulders and gravel and mud have been washed away. Here you're talking about hundreds or thousands of years worth of natural erosion occurring in a matter of hours, all triggered by idiot logging and road building. It's hard to capture the scale of this erosion with a video camera. Here you can see that the entire logging road has been washed off the side of the mountain. This led to massive slope failure that also washed out the next road below. Here I've parked our old crummy in the middle of a fresh slide after a bulldozer had reopened the road. How many dump trucks of soil and rock have been scoured loose here? And where did it all end up? If it isn't on the side of the hill, it went into the river. And here's a view looking down from where the truck was parked in the previous picture. Notice the acres of debris that were deposited when the flow hit a shallower gradient. And here's another view looking up the remains of a huge debris torrent. Here's a view looking down another gully. This channel has been scoured wide from debris torrents and plugged with gravel and busted wood. There were probably pools here only a few years ago that provided deep water all summer for salamanders and frogs and toads and maybe even small fish. A small oasis on the side of the mountain, all buried now under tons of gravel and smashed wood. Here's another gully full of logging debris, ready to come crashing down the mountain. This wood, plus all the soil between here and the river, might be gone after the next big rainstorm. But only a percentage of the flood debris remains along the gully channels. Most of it, especially logs and stumps which are not as heavy as rock, is flushed all the way down the slope into the river at the bottom of the valley, along with enormous quantities of mud and sand and gravel. The debris buries the existing stream bed, and the huge stumps and logs that crash down with the flood smash into the big trees along shore and rip the roots away that anchor the bank. As the live trees get eroded out of the banks, the main river channels become much wider and they get filled in with gravel. This video is an example of what has happened to a greater or lesser extent on all rivers on Vancouver Island where clearcutting has occurred. The huge old-growth stumps that anchor the stream banks are washed away along with the soil and gravel in the banks, creating a torrent of debris that bulldozes the banks downstream. As a general rule, prior to logging, Vancouver Island rivers were narrow channels between fairly stable banks anchored by the roots of huge trees with a complex pattern of alternating deep pools and shallow riffles. Even during periods of extreme drought, there was still deep, cool water in the pools and enough surface flow for fish to move from pool to pool. After logging, the same rivers become much wider and much shallower, and a much larger percentage of the summer low flows now pass through the deep beds of shifting gravel, where it's useless to fish, instead of over it. This is what was billed as sustainable yield logging in those days, a fluffy piece of PR gibberish. In reality, this is ecocide. 10 years of logging that wiped out an entire watershed. I was told by somebody at the time that this logging had exterminated every fish in the river. I doubt that, but it certainly killed off most of them. More important than killing off a bunch of fish, they ruined the salmonid habitat in this river for decades and centuries into the future. To my knowledge, there was no assessment of the habitat damage here by any branch of government. No penalties were imposed on the loggers or the corporate owners of the timber license. No reprimands were issued. In fact, the companies that did the logging were probably subsidized by the government to build the roads that caved in and trashed the river. And then they were certainly subsidized by the government to remove the same roads after the timber was logged. There is likely no restoration work planned here. This is government-subsidized fish habitat destruction. Just another isolated Van Isle River trashed by logging. No harm, no foul. Massive clear-cutting in the watersheds here has devastated native fish habitat, especially for salmon. In this analysis, I'm going to compare two similar watersheds. Both of them are home to endangered runs of wild fish that may soon be extinct forever, and that's why I'm not going to name the streams here. I'll call them N2 and N5 River. The N stands for nameless. Before going any further, let me explain that I've been scrounging a lot of the data I'll be presenting from the province's IMAP website. A shout out to them for making this huge archive of geographical data available to the public for free. I've downloaded historical aerial photos from IMAP and Google Earth so you can look back in time and see changes in the streams and forest cover. And I've obtained geographic data from IMAP that shows the extent of clearcuts and the year they were logged. Both watersheds are similar in geology and climate and fish and many other things. That's why I chose them for comparison. N2 River, which has been logged, is actually slightly larger. According to the BC Watershed Atlas, It is over 10,000 hectares where N5 River is just under 8,000. The main difference is that one watershed is not logged while the other has been largely clear-cut. I'm going to begin with N5 Lake where there's been no clear cutting. We're going to look at the area where the river flows into the lake, which is the same spot I showed you previously. Here's a picture that shows the lake and the river running through it. You can see that there has been no logging and there are giant trees growing along the banks of the river almost everywhere. Let's zoom in and have a closer look at the river upstream from the lake. Notice that there's a pattern here. Deep pools separated by shallow gravel riffles. On the right side, I've highlighted the deep pools in blue and the riffles in yellow. Now let's look at N2 Lake, which is similar in size and shape and altitude. Another Van Isle lake with a river running through it, surrounded by steep mountains. Look at the river above this lake. Notice that there are no pools. The river is very straight and shallow and wide. Why are these rivers so different? Which one looks like better habitat for fish? If you answered N2 River to the last question, turn this show off right now and go look for a job with a logging company or some government agency involved in environmental protection. There's a reason one river has deep pools and the other does not. And that reason is big trees. Now let's go there in person. The pools in N5 River are connected by stable gravel riffles that offer excellent places for salmon and trout to lay their eggs. Here I am paddling down N5 River through the area I showed in the air photo during the dead heat of summer when streams all across Vancouver Island were desperately low during a record drought. There's still plenty of water, deep enough to float a canoe in most places. The deeper pools are connected by stable gravel riffles. The pools and riffles stay in the same place year after year. Notice that there's still enough current between the pools to float a canoe. There's also enough water for big fish to swim up from the lake and into the big deep sanctuary pools. To me, this looks like a place where salmon and trout would love to hang out. Superb water quality, even in the dead heart of summer. Deep holes and cut banks with places for fish to hide. Big logs with current running under them. Beds of prime, stable spawning gravel. This is Club Med for salmon. What is it that creates the deep pools? Look at these gigantic spruce and cedar trees that line the banks. They force the current to cut deeper instead of wider, and create deep pools instead of huge expanses of shifting gravel. If you cut these trees, you lose this pool. The big trees make the big pools, and the big pools hold the big fish. Also notice that there are big fish lurking in the deeper pools. These happen to be sockeye salmon, waiting patiently for rain before they spawn. Now let's compare this to a similar nearby watershed, which I will call N2 River. This watershed is 25% larger in area, so you would expect 25% more water in the river, correct? No. There's probably the same amount of water flowing down into both lakes, but in the river that flows between huge trees, there are deep pools and big fish. The channel is narrow and the river is deeper. The river that has been clear-cut has no pools. There are no big fish, and there's no running water. There's a lot of dry gravel, but little visible water anywhere. Everywhere you look, there are smashed heaps of fresh driftwood. And even though there are acres and acres of perfect spawning gravel in N2 River, it's almost all useless to fish because it's high and dry most of the time, and it's constantly shifting when the flows increase. As you walk further up from the lake, the channel expands into a blasted landscape where acres of big old trees have been washed out by floods and smashed into piles by the current. On the day I was filming there, there was a monstrous log jam beyond this point where there were trees 3 meters in diameter at the base they had trees 2 meters in diameter jacked on top of them, and trees that were 2 meters in diameter jacked up on top of those two. And it was like 15-20 meters high. You had to climb off the ground to crawl over it, and it was just impossible. So I turned back at this point. Which river looks better for fish? The river that has been clear cut or the one that has not? This is ecocide. This is a dedicated effort by industry and government to destroy salmonid habitat, not just for today, but for decades and centuries to come. To my knowledge, no one from any level of government has ever investigated or even paid attention to the fish habitat damage on this river. No penalties or reprimands were issued to the loggers who walked away with millions of dollars from the trees they clear cut. No one from any level of government seriously considered restoration or remediation for this trashed out wasteland. No harm, no foul. Without human intervention, the fish habitat is crippled not just for the present, it is crippled for centuries into the future. And that's not the only issue. 30 years have passed since the worst logging occurred here, but the problems are not getting better over time, they're getting worse. I'll discuss this in greater detail in upcoming episodes. The salmon habitat is trashed in this area and getting worse every year, and now a large part of the ancient forest around the river is getting destroyed in the process. In a stable river that has not been logged off by maniacs, the same deep pools will exist for decades or centuries. One of the previous episodes of my Basstravaganza series, if you remember, I talked about Isaac Walton and the stone fishing temple that he and his friend built beside their favorite pool on the River Avon in England. That temple is still there today, and you can still go there and worship the same pool in the same river. Imagine if you built a fishing temple along the River Escalante just before it was logged. Not only would the pool be gone within a few years, but the temple would have been washed away too, or buried under a pile of gravel, and the entire surrounding area might now be a wasteland of shifting gravel and smashed driftwood. Welcome to Vancouver Island.